Hello, everyone. Welcome to the very first episode of our new podcast, Troisième Culture, or Third Culture in English. Third Culture Perspective is about navigating language, business, and multiculturalism. I'm Moses, originally from Sweden, with roots in Egypt. Sami,
And
over to you.
absolutely. Thank you, Moses. And I'm Sami. I'm an American of Egyptian heritage. Both Moses and I actually live in France, and we both have a burning love for helping others build their professional skills, build their knowledge, and how to advance their careers. And in particular, learn business English. Understand that English is a critical global language, and it's really important for all of us to master it for professional success.
Totally, Sammy. Thank you. Together, we aim to explore the fascinating intersection of culture, language, and business in this podcast. We'll share our experiences as third culture kids. Correct me if I'm wrong, Sammy. And we would like as well to discuss the nuances of English teaching with a focus on North America, France, and Europe as a whole, and offer fresh insights on leadership and multiculturalism.
So we're starting the
Um,
series. Oh, thank you, Moses. Do we? It's
It's good.
we,
Our first episode, but it's super interesting. Actually, I would like us if you could tell our audience to more about how we met and maybe even about the global network that we are part of.
Yeah. So no, I mean it's actually an amazing story and a unusual coincidence of how things happen, right? But we are both part of what is called the BMW Foundation Responsible Leaders Network. It's a global foundation that connects leaders from across the world, whether they're in education or any other field, tech, finance, you name it. People who are impact oriented and change makers in whatever field they're in. And I've been part of this network for many years. Moses, we welcomed you on board as well. And it's been quite a journey, met some incredible people. But interestingly, we have a mutual friend within the network who knows Moses, knows me, and said, "This is a match made in heaven, a professional match made in heaven," and introduced us to each other. We both come from unique backgrounds, both from Egyptian heritage, both raised in Western context, both focused on advancement and professional development, and in so many ways. And so she said, "Hey, you guys should talk." That was it. Just said, "Hey, you guys should talk. Moses meets Sammy, Sammy meet Moses," and here we are. We just hit it off. I think that we have very similar energy. We both have really very, very driven goals when it comes to the advancement of those of us here who are listening to us and to others as well. And so that introduction slowly led to a building friendship, and then it led to where we are today. It's pretty amazing, right?
Yeah, totally. And the fact is, we're both ended up living relatively close to each other. You live in Paris, I live in Orleans, which, well, the old Orleans. There's the original Orleans, in France, and then the new Orleans,
Wait, you
which
don't
sort
mean New Orleans, Louisiana, or?
of where Lil Wayne comes from, I believe.
I, I think so.
Most of you listen to
Hey, hey, as the American, I'd say that New Orleans came first. I'm just kidding.
it. Yeah, exactly. And that's super funny because of the cliches. I remember a few days we talked about them, and like, as a person who's always struggled or fought against discrimination cliches, I caught myself, having my own biases against other cultures, and especially living in France, living in Europe. As Europeans, we have uh, a lot of how would you call it in English? Like we misconceptions about how the average American is, and we tend to generalize. So like remember Disneyland, our Disneyland joke. Can you tell us more about that?
So
Because I'm embarrassed to tell this story myself. So, but
there's,
I would like to see how you
as
perceive.
with all the love, I'm embarrassed for you, you know? No, I would say this. There's often a stereotype, and it's part of the things that we want to dispel, right? I'm an American living in Europe, and obviously there's quite a number of stereotypes that we've faced. My wife and I, both of us, have faced about the idea that we are somehow living in this fantasy Disneyland kind of thing where everything is rainbows and butterflies. Paris is the city of love. We run through the mountains and we go in circles like the sound of music. And unfortunately, although some of those stereotypes come from the perception of Americans of Europe, right? That Europe is a perfect place, right? Where everything is just beautiful and perfect and life is perfect. And there are definitely some beautiful things, of course, about this continent and about France in particular as well. But on the other hand, Americans are much more aware than people give us credit for. Not all. Of course, there are some, like in any other country, that don't have a passport, that don't travel, or don't really aren't as curious. But I definitely think, Moses, that, if from our context, part of the reason that we made this journey, and many people aren't willing to, many people within Europe wouldn't do the same journey that we made, to travel across a continent, or across the Atlantic to resettle in another country, take those risks, understand that there are some language barriers and other aspects that make it challenging. Um, how much more adventurous and open can one be, right? And I know many people within France may not necessarily do the same thing. I mean, I don't know. What do you think?
No, and I think that's a minority, and it's super funny because I feel like Europeans are divided two groups. The first group is a group that thinks all Americans are, kind of ignorant, never leave their country. They are, they eat supersized meals for McDonald's for breakfast. Yeah. And the other group is, I would say, we also, at least the group I belong to, of entrepreneurs and people with entrepreneurial mindsets. And I think we discussed this offline many times before. Um, we really look up to the American um, um, can do mentality. Like, I can do this. Yes, we can. Hopeful, persistent, perseverant mindset, entrepreneurial
Mhm,
mindset. And I think, as you mentioned before, no culture is perfect. However, we should take the best out of any culture we're exposed to. And I think the American culture has a lot to, especially the American grind, and has a lot to offer people in Europe. And maybe it has to do with immigration. I mean,
mhm,
regardless the horrible history the things that happened to the natives before and all these things,
mhm,
um, you know, I think that the fact that the whole many community, most everybody in the states was as an immigrant at some point, um, maybe led to this. People came over to the states looking for a better life, and so your only option was hope. And I think it's for us, I'm a second generation European. Other Europeans, even, like stuck, we're in France now. Now we have 3 4 generations of people who came here, probably over 60 70 years ago. You can tell, many of them have this hope and this entrepreneurial mindset, and I would say that many of these people look up to the states with admiration, because we feel like, we have a lot to learn from. So all I'm saying is we shouldn't just, dismiss America because of McDonald's and because of, like, supersize me and all these, all these misconceptions. There are other things we can learn a lot from it. Obviously, we should, especially when it comes to entrepreneurship, which is an important part of our podcast.
mhm.
um yeah, so that's what
I
I believe. Is there any, like, in the States, is there any quote unquote negative stereotypes about Europeans, about
Well,
or
I'll touch on that, but I want to capture on something that you just said, which was really, really interesting, and it's about the aspect of hope, right? And I grew up in a context where obviously I also come like just like you from an immigrant background, and my grandparents and parents both immigrated from Egypt. My grandparents in the 1960s, father in the 70s, and everyone resettled in a new country, in a and took a risk doing so, right? And so many Americans share that story, of their parents and grandparents and great groups, and sometimes even fifth generation, right? Who gave up everything, left everything behind to find a new uh, destiny for themselves. I grew up playing a game, and most of us called the Oregon Trail. This was something that actually it's very popular, and it still exists today. They made a new version of it on the video game systems, but we all played it in school. And this Oregon Trail was the idea of these settlers that were traveling from the East Coast to the West Coast during I believe it was during the gold rush, when California had a lot of gold and everybody was rushing across the US to try to find this wealth. And the whole concept of this was about survival. You have a wagon, you have a couple of people to guide you. You meet up some Native Americans here and there. You have to find a way to get your wagon across rivers and mountains and you name it, and you have to survive. And the key was that you have to survive and you have to get there, and you have to get there safely with your family. And we actually loved this game. I would say almost every American listening right now, and maybe some Europeans, they will know this game, the Oregon Trail. That was the kind of that symbolizes so much about what we learned of what it meant to be American. Survival, strength, hope, not giving up, right? At whatever it takes. And I think that that's unfortunately what is missing from the narrative. Supersize me, these kinds of images that people have of the US. We living in the US weren't going to McDonald's every day. That was not a fact. Believe it or not, we were not having breakfast, lunch, and dinner at McDonald's. We enjoyed good cuisine. We enjoyed good experiences. We went to the theater. We did all the things that people perceive Americans may not do as much. And so I think that people have to understand, within the concept that within a vast country like the US, just like in France, right? You have different regions and different philosophies. You have different types of people, different subcultures, and people's willingness also shifts. But yeah, I just had to touch on that because having we'll talk about kind of my graduation, but I have an entrepreneurship professor who I mentioned to you offline said the same thing. He said, to the Americans in the room, and only three Americans in my program, for my international MBA program here in Paris, he said, "You Americans take risks. We know that. We acknowledge that you take risks that many of us are unwilling to take, us as in the French, are unwilling to take. And that's something that should be admired." And he's like, it's slowly shifting in France, but that willingness to just give up everything, take a risk, put your bets on one thing for a business or whatever else it would be, is something that doesn't exist at the same level and strength in France. So I know it's a bit off of your question, but I thought it was important to mention.
I think it's spot on, and basically, I would say that it has some historical explanations and reasons. In France, a lot of people think that the state is supposed to take care of them. And and you see it because of the high taxes and welfare system.
Hmm.
Whereas in the States, it's a bit different. The States, the government is there just to maintain order, but it's up to us to grind and to earn our own lives. And but I'm not saying it's better or worse. It's two different models, but I think there's so much the government can do, and at the end of the day, everybody should be responsible for their lives. You know, So it's super important to remember that you can't just play the victim and blame everything on the government.
Hmm.
And I think even like in the recent administration in France here, that was the narrative in the government. The President Macron he used to say as well that it's time for us to stand up and he didn't say it literally, but he was like it's time to man up somehow.
Hmm.
Like it's time to just we need to work harder. The government can't do anything. Ask yourself, like Kennedy used to say, you should ask yourself what you can do for your nation, or the other way around, which is super important. Um, I think when it comes to entrepreneurship, it's I think it's linked as well to the mindset that the government should do everything, whereas in other countries those are, I mean, even in Lebanon, for example, you know, I know it's a bit off. We're talking about Europe and the States, but Lebanese, I think they are an important part of the entrepreneurial ecosystem anywhere in the world. And we have many Lebanese people with Lebanese heritage in Europe and in the States. And these guys had to become entrepreneurs and business people because they had, for since ever, they didn't have a government, or they had
Hmm.
like dysfunctional governments,
Hmm.
which shows you as well that, when you have to swim, like when you're, thrown in the ocean, you have no other option but to learn to swim. um, so I think it's very important, and also, so this, I think it's something that is very important to install in our kids and teach them how to be entrepreneurial in a daily situation. Like, don't always come up to me, ask for this for the answer. And also, when you see your kid on a playground fall, don't just rush up to him or to her, you know, trying to make sure that everything is fine. Just let them, handle their own problem. And also, falling, and this is another thing that I noticed, that, and it's also very important to teach our kids that when you falling or making mistakes is not actually, it's not bad. You shouldn't be afraid of making mistakes. You should
Hmm.
actually be happy um, that you made a mistake, because this is the only way of learning and of growing and becoming a better person. Spanx, it's an American company. I don't know if it sounds familiar.
Kardashian
No, no, sorry,
is
no, it's
involved.
not Kardashian. It's
Then it may not be
Spanx.
Spanx.
Well, she promoted. No, Spanx
Ah,
actually
okay.
was at some point by the Kardashians, maybe.
Uh-huh.
But the owner is a female entrepreneur. I can't recall her name right now, but she used to say that around the dinner table, her dad every week used to ask them, "How many mistakes have you done today?" Or
Mm,
how many mistakes have you done this week?
mm,
And the more mistakes you made, the happier her dad and more proud he
mm.
was of them. Would show you how, like, and this actually taps into like the entrepreneurial mindset. Entrepreneurs make a lot of mistakes and they are
Yeah,
not afraid of making mistakes. This is the only way you can, whether you can become an entrepreneur, you can also learn a language, because part of our podcast as well is talking about, language acquisition and how to learn how to teach
of
and
course.
learn a language. I also work as an English teacher in France, and most of the parents and the kids even, they tell me that we're afraid of speaking, of learning of English, because we're afraid of making mistakes. We're afraid of speaking English with an accent. I always
Yeah.
tell them, everybody has an accent. That's for starters. It's normal to have an accent, but also having an accent means that you speak more than one language. And who cares if you have an accent, as long as you understand and you make yourself understood.
So I think it's important for our listeners to know a bit of a background about each of us, very briefly, I guess. So I'm curious, Mos, what is your legacy, I guess? What is your tradition? What is your background? What brought you to today, I guess? And we can try to each do it in an hour or less. I'm just kidding. So yeah,
Let's
I
give
mean,
away half of our little audience.
exactly, exactly. So yeah, I'm curious. I'm sure everyone's curious. What is your brief story?
Well, brief story. I have a double degree in business, if of international business and political science, from Denmark, from the Copenhagen Business School, which is like top. I'm gonna brag a little bit. One of the best business schools in Scandinavia and Europe, and globally as well. It's highly ranked. I have a master's degree in public administration. I started out my career working for the private sector for an IT company, and then I went to the Middle East in 2011, just 2010, late 2010. The goal was to start a regional office for this Swedish IT company, but a few weeks later, the Arab Spring started, And when it happened, I I just picked up the phone and called him and I told him it's not going to work out. There's no way we can do anything right now, mainly because it's uncertain. The future of the region is uncertain. But this actually made me realize how interesting and fascinating politics was. So I decided I quit that job and I started just applying for jobs that had to do with politics, elections, and I joined an international. It's called Intergovernmental Organizations, International IDEA. It's called. It's an international organization that works with elections in different countries in Africa, Asia, everywhere basically, and even the states. I worked for them for a while and then moved on. A couple of years later, I worked in Canada. I worked in Libya, always in war torn and
Mhm,
difficult contexts and with communities. We
mhm,
then worked for the United Nations and then BBC Media Action. Working on capacity building, working with journalists, with CSO activists, and vulnerable communities. A few years Fast forward a few years, I started my own company. Um, are you still there?
I'm here.
Yep, for a little bit. Okay. A few years later, I started my own company, and the company's focus was to work with youth to get their voice out there, to help them actually identify their strength and amplify their voice regarding community issues. We worked offline, online, worked with foreign ministries, across, and even like with the State Department as well. We had funding from them. We worked a little bit everywhere in North Africa, in the Middle East, and in Europe. Always working with young people on difficult issues related to identity, unemployment. And then one day I became a father, and then I realized how important education is. And in this podcast, we'll talk a lot about education as an important part of our careers and of
Hmm.
things we care about. And I realized they cannot, I have many. I've seen many things that I think it could be dramatically and drastically improved in the French system as opposed to the Swedish system. I'm not sure about the American system. We'll discuss that later. And I started reading books. I even, as I believe that in order for you, if you want to change society, you should start with yourself. So I
Hmm.
started home with my kids, but and then I became a French teacher as, aside from my company. And because I believe that, it's the only way, education is the only way we can change the future of a nation, is because education actually has to do with your mindset, with your how you see the world,
Hmm.
and how you can make an impact on it.
Hmm.
So that's in a nutshell. And today, my hope with this podcast is that we'll be able to share our ideas, our vision of a better society, multicultural, inclusive society in Europe, basically in France, in Europe, and everywhere else. And hopefully, we'll be able as well to put some French subtitles on this podcast because it's I think it will benefit a lot of people in France. People with um, open-minded people, who really don't care about whether you're an American or a French.
Hmm.
It's people who care, who really want to get the best ideas, no matter, regardless of where these ideas come from. What about
Well
you,
said.
Sammy?
Well said, first of all. Incredible background. Thanks, Moses. So yeah, no, I mean, I'll kind of just backtrack as noted. My grandparents and parents are immigrants from Egypt, much like your parents were. And my grandfather and grandmother, my grandfather's an engineer actually, natural gas engineer, and with the wars between Egypt and Israel in the 50s and the 60s, they struggled a lot. They lost everything. They in '68 immigrated to the U.S. Because of those challenges. And my grandfather started working for NASA actually as an engineer for Apollo 11, as you probably heard of the mission before. He was working in Kennedy Space Center. They were living in Cocoa Beach in Florida. And you know, it just again, it starts off the very American story that you know that they really came from struggle and made something. Eventually, they came to New Jersey. My father immigrated as well, completed his medical school training in the U.S. In New York. So my father's a physician, mother's of a science background, had a career as a scientist. And again, the immigrant story, right? They came, they worked hard, and they built themselves. And you know, I was meant to be a physician. It was my father's intention for me. You know, my sister went on to get her PhD in history, so that for him was a oh no, the one less physician, you know, even though she's had such an incredible degree and incredible career, and so it turned to me, and I started off, true story, as a biology major in undergraduate. And but I absolutely I mean I like science, but I hated the idea of being a doctor. First of all, I despise blood and I hate the sight of blood. So how do you become a doctor if you can't stand blood? And so I came to them early on and I said not really my thing, you know, and so I kind of went through a period of self-discovery. I did political science, I studied some French, I had a lot of shifts and shifts, and all along everyone was telling me that, you know, you're naturally, I guess, a gifted trainer, right? A teacher, a motivator, you know, all of these things. And I did not want to be really a teacher. It's not, teachers are amazing, you know, but I wanted to do something in entrepreneurship. And I wanted to understand how I could connect those two things. And the creative juices in me, because I started working corporate out of college. I was doing business development for a tech company that I was working with different accounts. I graduated Rutgers University, by the way, one of the oldest in the US. And then I started thinking, okay, how do I got a job, as everyone does, working with different accounts like Havas and New York Stock Exchange and a few others. And then in all along, I was like, I need to do something for myself. I need to, if there's any place I'm going to do this, it's going to be in the USA, right? It's going to be in the USA. This was back in the mid 2000s. So I started doing some informal trainings on the side. I was doing language training. I was doing some mentorship and coaching, and I got some certifications along the way. And I was like, you know, 2008 came along. I started the company. 3 years later, in 2011, without even being anywhere near ready, I quit my job and I went full time as an entrepreneur. And I was called crazy. I was
American
called
hustle.
the American hustle, exactly. And I was told, especially by my immigrant family, that you're nuts. You know, you're nuts. How are you going to support yourself? What are you going to do? How are you going to get married? How are you going to whatever? All of the usual stories, right? And I stood my ground, and you know, I continued and I pushed along. And then in 2015, I secured a really, really good contract and kept continued to grow along the way. And I haven't been back to a full-time corporate position since. And are there struggles along the way? Of course. Do I regret any of it? No. And so uh, fast forward a little bit, COVID comes along. I'm at this point, I'm married with my wife, and you know, we were like, life is short. Let's have a bit of an experience that takes us out of our element, out of our zone. We have traveled quite a bit and had the opportunity to. I've been personally to 58 countries, you know, and I really believe that it's critical for an American, not so bad, right? And I believe that it's critical and crucial to experience new things. And I've done solo travel and I've done travel with my wife as well. And so after COVID, we said, life's short, let's take a risk. And I wanted to do my graduate studies. I wanted to do my MBA. Just to augment my skills and experiences as an entrepreneur. And I have spent quite a bit of time in France as well. My mother was a bit of a Francophile. You know, we used to appreciate a lot of things about the French culture. She grew up going to French schools, as many had done in Egypt, but also it really was ingrained into our home as well in many ways. The Egyptian culture, French culture, and American culture kind of fused together. And I, at that point, spoke the language fairly well. And so my wife and I said, let's go to Paris, you know, let's go to Paris. Let's move for a bit and make a change and see what happens. And so I started looking for programs that were great value, great reputation, and Paris-Panthéon-Sorbonne had a really good international MBA program that brought in people from dozens of countries, and I mean 24 countries represented in my program out of 27 students, which was incredible, like the United Nations right there. And I applied. Actually, we just said, let's apply and see what happens, because at the point we had not told our families, we had not said anything. The acceptance came along. I was very honored by that. And we then said, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? And we thought about our furniture. We thought about our friends. We thought about our we thought about everything. And yeah, I had a family member who just said, you really don't have all that much time here on this planet we call Earth, in this home that we call Earth. If you're not going to take this risk, you may regret it forever. You may regret it forever. And sold half our stuff, put the rest in storage, told our families, told our friends, packed our bags, and left the country. And honestly, it was just, I mean, my wife did not speak much French at all. I'm decent in it. It's improved significantly since moving, but we arrived in France in 2021 on just a dream: education, academics, growth, personal growth, right? Development. And here we are. 2 years later, we're still here. I actually just, as you know, graduated 2 days ago with my international MBA. Literally 2 days ago. Thank you, thank you. And it's something that to me it's two things, right? It's very personal, but it's also very American. And so I think that you asked about a stereotype, right? How many are there stereotypes about that Americans have about Europeans? And there are stereotypes, right? And one of those stereotypes is the stereotypes about us, that there's a stereotype that we're not willing to. It's ironic because there's this belief that Americans take risks and are willing to be adventurous, but then doesn't that extend to many other aspects of our lives? I've gone around the world in those nearly 60 countries, and some of the most adventurous and frankly chillest people that I've met have been American. True that there are some Americans who, unfortunately, because they don't leave the country, they have misperceptions. They might think that America is the only country that can do anything great, and that's really unfortunate because it's not
I
how we
see
should
that
think.
there too.
Absolutely. But is there not exceptionalism, to your point, everywhere? Is there not exceptionalism in France, where people believe, and France is a great country in many ways. There are great things about it, and there are challenges too. But there are people here who believe that it can do no wrong, just like there are people in America who believe that it can do no wrong. So that's the story. That's where we are today. For the indefinite future, we are here. We have embraced many things about our life here, and my French has improved substantially. My wife's is growing as well. So that's another thing. I speak to people and they say, "You speak French? Oh my God, you're American. Vous parlez français, mais comment ça ça ne marche pas, you know?" And it's like it's just it's entertaining to see that. And so, but yeah, that's the story, that's the background, and that's how we are where we are today. So thanks for asking.
And congrats on the graduation. I think that
Thank you.
was a great milestone to achieve. So what is next? And well, before I ask what's next, and before I forget, I wanted to ask you about your how did you learn French, and what do you have any advice to non-French speakers about the best way of learning, or any language, anyone who wants to learn a language? What would be your advice to him or her?
It's an amazing question, because that is the multi-million dollar question for everyone who is trying and struggling and fighting through. And I think that for me, I had studied it growing up. I had written research reports. I minored in a university. Um, I had traveled to France many times prior to moving here. So my moving here was probably my ninth or tenth time in the country. And so I had been to different regions of the country, from small villages to large cities. And so in many ways that's an exception, right? And in someone I know French friends of mine who have been to less parts of the country than myself as an American has. But that being said, one thing that I have done, and it's why my French has improved substantially since arriving, is take risks and speak. Take risks and speak. Do not, you mentioned that story, and it's a really good one, right? How many mistakes has she made today, right? Her father asked her from Spanx, right? How many mistakes have you made? And he was proud that she made mistakes. Be proud of your mistakes because they are part of your development, right? What is it that one can do? I mean, I'm not sure if I'm in a position to give all the advice in the world, but I'll talk from my own experience. That coming to France and having traveled here prior, obviously I had some foundation in the language. I was willing to take a risk and put myself out there in order to learn the language. I other than formal academic studies, I never really took actual French courses. Academic, yes, I minored and I studied at university. I did things like that, but did I have a tutor or anything like that? Never, never. My tutor was experience, and my tutor has been experience. I'm not saying that having a tutor is not a good thing. It is important. My wife has a tutor in French, and it's very helpful to get someone who can correct you and assist you and push you along. But nothing will beat experience. Nothing will beat taking risks. And I go back to the Spanx story that you said, Moses, about,
Mm.
she was sitting with her father and he said, how many or how many mistakes did you make today? And he was so happy that she had made mistakes, right? That she didn't have a quote unquote perfect day. Because what is a perfect day, right? Um, and that's exactly what you need to do with language learning. You need to be willing to make mistakes. You need to be willing to take risks. You need to be willing to be embarrassed because, frankly, people are judging you a lot less than you think they're judging you. People are not always sitting there waiting for you to mess up all the time. That's not how it works. And that aspect of social anxiety that many people have is what's holding them back from actually advancing in the language. And that is, yes, for French, could go for any other language. So for me, when I arrived, I said to myself, and I committed to myself 2 years ago, that I will only speak French in every context where I'm able to do so. So, frankly, I never ask somebody, parlez-vous anglais? I never say, parlez-vous
Mhm.
anglais? I never do. I immediately start en français. And for me, that's important because no matter what mistakes I make, I am learning and I'm advancing. And sometimes the French will correct you. This is a known thing, right? They will pause and correct you. Une, le, la, whatever the case is, right? They will, and you learn to not get offended. You learn to take it as kind of a funny, endearing kind of thing, because Americans would never do that, by the way. Um, you know, go
It's
ahead.
super interesting, actually, because it makes me. I've always thought about this, and I've lived in Canada. I've been to London many times. Never been to the States though yet, but I've accepted
Soon, soon, soon.
your invitation to
Absolutely.
go town. Um, I feel like Anglo-Saxons or Anglo-Saxon cultures are more tolerant to accent than maybe European cultures. So it's like it's totally okay to make mistakes as long as I understand more or less what you're saying, the context. It's totally okay, and I'm not gonna correct you. Not that correcting is bad, but it's not like it's gonna be a hurdle in our communication. Whereas I feel like in France or and in other cultures, in Sweden at times, having an accent might be like a deal breaker, and people like get just hung up on it. However, it's super interesting because Sweden lately in the last 20 years, because actually Sweden was the country that admitted the highest number of refugees from
Hmm.
Syria
Hmm.
in Europe. We took in over 300,000 for a country of 10 million.
Yeah,
That's a
wow.
lot, almost half a million people,
Wow.
to a country that has only 10 million people. Like having an accent now is more, like you don't think about it as much as you would 20 years ago.
Hmm. Hmm.
So do you think that Americans are more tolerant to accents? Because I've never been to the States, so like then like let's say somebody, your business, you're a business owner, and someone like super smart applies for a job at your company, but he has a thick accent in English. How would that be a problem to you? He
So for
doesn't work
me,
in sales, okay?
it's
Yeah.
it's 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 well said. I mean, so my
No.
I never really mentioned my company does, but my company, it essentially does leadership development training, soft skills training, business English training, etc. So to answer your question, um, it depends on what they're training or instructing, right? If they're instructing in business English, I generally need them to be native speakers. I don't obviously care what background they are, right? That's not even a question, but it's the question of the ability to be proficient enough to be able to train other people. Um, but other aspects, absolutely. I've had people who have worked, coordinators, it's et cetera, who have had been internationally born, have had different accents, and that's never been an issue. Of course, if somebody is not a native speaker in the sense of that they're born speaking English, but they speak English, let's say, as well as you, for example, or other people, that's not really much of an issue. So when I say native speaker, it's a bit of a broad term. But yeah, for having a thick, heavy accent, it becomes difficult just to train other people. But in
Mm.
day-to-day communication, I will say this. Americans, you know, I don't necessarily value that we've come to a point now where everything seems to be offensive. I think that's something that a topic that we can
Yeah,
talk about.
I agree with you.
The differences between European and American context, and in some ways it's infiltrated into the Europe as well.
Yeah.
I don't think everything should be offensive all the time, but I do think that people will find it offensive in the U.S. Let's say, for example, you're at the KES, right, the cashier,
Mm.
and you're paying, and the person who's the customer is speaking to the cashier. If the cashier starts to correct that person's English, it could be a major thing. It could be up to even a lawsuit of discrimination. It's that serious. And so I think Americans, because it's a fusion of dozens upon dozens of cultures and backgrounds and countries, we have come to a point where we just tolerate that people speak differently and act differently and think differently and all of that. Um, there's a whole wisdom though to where we are today, and to whether our tolerance has gotten us to a point where now the cohesion is impacted. And it's a question.
Mm.
I'm not suggesting either way, but to where someone can come to the United States and spend decades and never learn English well. Should that really be English? May not be the official. We don't have an official language, by the way. So English is not necessarily
Yeah.
the official
Could be
language,
Spanish soon.
but
Can
it's the lingua
change.
franca. Exactly.
Yeah, it's a lingua franca.
Exactly, lingua franca of the country. And so as long as that remains, is it not important for people to be able to communicate well? And
Yeah,
that's where, and I think Europe is having this a similar conversation. It's beginning because
I think so too.
with the challenges of migration. So
Definitely. And I mean, like, look at someone, an American, a very prominent American in the States, Elon Musk. He's an American citizen now, and the guy speaks with a South African accent. He doesn't have like which is South African accent, which is a mix of between Dutch, British, and he still kept his accent, and
mhm,
and it was never an issue for to anyone. I feel like if we had an American, a French Elon Musk, that would be a major issue, probably. Like someone like who's first citizen with an accent, it could be an issue. So something to maybe to discuss in our future
I have
or
a
our next
question for you actually
podcast.
though.
Yeah,
So you
yeah,
grew up also in a, kind of a multicultural context, right? Between multiple countries, having infused, you speak English exceptionally well, but that may not have always been the case, or there are times maybe where have you been seen, whether it's in Sweden or in France, from an immigrant lens? How do you deal with that? I mean, have you been corrected at time? Like, how is it here? Because I've been living here, but you've lived here all your life in Europe. So,
yeah.
I can speak from the American context and a little from the French context, but what is your experience?
My experience, I remember at a younger age, seeing, maybe my parents having an accent, and it was like it was a big issue. Like people in my family were some at times, certain situations that were like too scared to speak to say something, even though they spoke well the language, because they knew they were aware of their accents. But we're talking about that was like a long time ago. I'm not going to reveal my age in this podcast.
Not yet, not yet.
But not yet, exactly. Not on the first episode. But again, it feels so you grow up like very aware of your accent in the language in the country you live in. So I lived in Sweden, I lived in Spain as well as a teenager, and the accent. It's so funny because it felt like the focus was on the accent, not on the grammar and the vocabulary. And sometimes when you actually focus too much on your accent, you get blocked and you don't learn. You just you're like totally, you can't express yourself properly because you're just trying to sound as native speakers.
Hmm.
The funny thing is that, and I remember at a young age, I heard somebody told me in Spain that, hey, even in Spain and in different regions, it happens in Sweden too, and I'm sure it happens in the States, it happens in France. People have different accents depending on where they come from. You know, like you could, for example, be born in Barcelona
Hmm.
to parents who come to Madrid,
Hmm.
and you end up mixing both accents. Or in Sweden, one actually of my best friends, his parents came from Stockholm. He was born in Malmö, and in Malmö, we say the R with a R sounds like a French R.
Mm.
So the guy, and it has like a melody that's totally, it's very distinct. It's totally different from the Stockholm accent. The guy actually, he didn't roll the R's, so he spoke with like the R, like a R,
Mm.
pronounced the R like in
Mm.
Arabic, but with very strong R from Stockholm. However, he had the Malmo melody
Intonation. Yeah.
intonation.
Yeah.
So he was obviously he spoke differently, like different from everybody else. But he was confident enough because he was blonde, blue eyed. So he didn't even like think about his own accent.
Mm. Hmm.
Whereas other people in my entourage, me included, I'm not gonna
Hmm.
lie,
Hmm.
we were so aware of this that you had to speak perfect with the perfect accent.
Hmm.
Like to me, as a younger kid, because to me it was more important to speak with a local accent than to learn, sophisticated words or
Of course.
idioms, and you know, which is crazy because now in hindsight, I realize that a lot of people, even in Sweden, like I want to say like who are Scandinavian, like descendant from Vikings, white, blue-eyed people. Many of them have like different accents from the norm, like and it's not an issue even, you know. And again, so I think this is a major problem that many French people, whether it's kids or adults, face when they try to learn English or other languages. It's their own biases actually are playing into this.
I think that's a very profound point, and I think that we need to, and I really think this is actually something we will discuss and should discuss at length in an episode just committed to just accents because it's such an important
Definitely.
conversation, both in the European, French, and American and North American context. Um, what is how is it that we show like what kind of dignity and respect must we show towards another individual no matter what background or what the way they speak, whatever the case is. And I think unfortunately, I think that there are some people who have good intentions, right? And some people who they correct you with the interest of making sure that you were right, and that I've never been offended by that when in France, right? If I and I've also been complimented a lot by a lot of French people. It's happened. I mean, even my wife has witnessed to this multiple times where someone's come up and said, "You speak French really well. Like how?" And literally, like I said before, it's like
Yeah,
there's a surprise because I'm American. How do you
yeah,
speak French?
yeah,
And I don't, and I actually make an effort to do the correct French. Like I don't say bonjour, ça va. I say bonjour, ça va. Bonjour. Je m'appelle, not je m'appelle. And so I
yeah,
make an effort to
yeah,
actually do it correctly as best as I can. And I think that does go a long way. So I wonder, Moses, is there not maybe a dual responsibility, right? On one end, society needs to be a bit tolerant and understanding that people come from different places, and that with that
definitely.
is going to come a huge plethora of accents and
Yeah,
ways of speaking. And to your point about even within regions, right? I wonder
yeah,
if Malmo might be influenced perhaps by Denmark because if I'm not
yeah,
mistaken, they're right there,
definitely.
and
Exactly.
Stockholm is a bit more withdrawn from there, and
It used to be
and
part
on
of
the
the
other
world.
exactly, and on the other end, is it not also the responsibility of the individual who is residing in that country, wherever it might be, to also make an effort to communicate well,
Yeah,
and to learn the language of the country and to be able to uh, interact on a greater level? So I think it's a
definitely.
it's a question that we can flesh out, but isn't it not a dual responsibility in a way of society and also of the
Mhm.
individual?
I totally agree. I mean, I've been living here for in France for many years, and prior to that, I lived in Tunisia, which is a French-speaking country. And my advice when it comes to learning languages, because when I speak French to people, people often think I'm native, like I'm from here. Because again, France, going back to accents, France used to have colonies all across Africa. People came and went to many different accents. So I would say France is it's very actually multicultural. Um, what I did was that I never it's the immersion methodology that works, and this exactly that's what I always recommend to my students, that try to watch movies, for example, in French, sorry, in English, in original, like VO, version originale. you know um, learn, try to live the language, learn, listen to music, reading is a very important, and scientifically proven that reading actually in any language, even in your native language, or will improve the way you speak. So
Mhm,
apparently we'll have to dig into this research. Apparently actually reading makes you speak better, because it's linked somehow, your eyes are linked to your tongue somehow, like you're something in the brain.
mhm,
um so it's very important, and yes, it's a dual responsibility. You have to meet them halfway. So I believe that people should acknowledge the effort that you're making, but you still have to make that effort. So you can't say, like, sitting about doing nothing all day, never read, never that you don't learn the language, and then you complain that people are having issues with you trying to explain yourself. But also, let's not forget, our parents or grandparents, people who maybe came to Europe or to the States as adults, then and maybe they're having a harder time. And then, of course, everybody's different. Some people have a flair for languages, others don't. We shouldn't forget this. But
mhm,
so it depends on the person. But obviously, there are hacks. There's also the Pareto law, 20-80%, 20-80 rule, where you can, in order for you to learn a language, you just try to focus on the most important words and idioms, grammar, that will help you sound like a native, or speak in a way that impresses people, or make
mhm.
them feel like you're part of the culture. And there are many hacks, and it's something that I have studied extensively, and would be great to share them in this podcast. And yeah, I mean, language is not it's not an easy task, but it's doable. You can always learn it. And I'm impressed by what you did. I mean, I feel like, coming from Europe, it's easier for us, especially people speak more than one. See, it's easier for us to learn multiple languages, because you grow up exposed to many languages, even sometimes in the same country. I mean, look at Belgium. Speak French, they speak Dutch, and it's part of the same country.
Or Switzerland. Yeah,
Or Switzerland,
yeah.
Sweden, like Sweden, we're right next to Denmark. And sometimes we take for granted, like saying that you speak more than one language. I would say that whenever I told someone that I speak 5 languages, it's my American friends who are more impressed than my European friends. You know. Um,
And exactly. And I think as we wrap up here, like the fact is, um, we have to factor in geography. And again, it's something we're going to touch on much more throughout the podcast. But we have to factor in geography, right? America is isolated in many ways, right? By two oceans, right? Yes, we have Mexico to our southern border. Yes, we have Canada to our northern border. But the fact is that we have a great distance between us and many of these. It's not a continent as much as we have English and Spanish and some French in Quebec. It's not really a continent that has dozens of languages the way that Europe does. And so you're definitely going to naturally have that exposure to different cultures, different aspects. And also America prides itself on this idea that you arrive as you were and you become American, right? There's a big
mm,
debate now on what that means. It's a huge debate in
mm,
America right now what that means. But, you know, the concept was you learn English, You work hard, you fight for your family, no matter what background you came from, you have the same rights. You are an American. That's the fundamental nature of it, right? So I think with the different experiences, I mean, there are French Americans, Americans that are of French descent, right? They came. Anthony Bourdain was a great example, an incredible traveler, and one of the biggest losses in my view to experience an
Mm,
adventure. But he was a great example of someone who was a French American. I mean, he wasn't born in France; he was born in America. Multi generations ago, his family was Bourdain, right, from
uh,
France, and the fact is, he identified that several times in his show. But as anything else, he's an American, and I think that that's the story of so many people across our country. But I just want to note on impact of, because I had taken just some brief notes here, but people might, want to know what are we going to go forward. I want you to talk about what we're going to talk about potentially, if you can, if you don't mind, like going forward. But there are 3 points real quick on impact that I want all of our listeners to know that we want to hope for. And those are awareness and empowerment, right? We really want to elevate awareness about the importance of business English, right? Because it's today still the global language. Um,
mm,
but also professional development, risk taking, entrepreneurship, personal development, right? Building your own skills in order to be successful. Um, and we want to share that with a French audience and an international audience as well. Of course, an American audience, Swedish audience, Canadian audience. We welcome
yeah.
all, equal opportunity welcome.
Mm,
And talk about some actionable strategies that people can take, resources that they can consider, and of course our own personal experience, right? To empower people to take control of their journey the way that we're trying to as well. We also want to people to understand how we can influence policy and practice, right? Whether it's
mm,
on a social level, a higher level, learning where the educational institutes are, right? That they can actually learn from, learning where the communities are, all of those things that will help people advance. And then, of course, and this is, I think, the most important thing for you and I, is fostering a global mindset, right?
mm.
Knowing that we have shared experiences, knowing that we have unique experiences, and trying to help foster that global mindset in our listeners, and highlighting really the benefits of cross-cultural communication and having some sort of an international savvy. It's so important for us. So I think if anything I missed, but I think that those are some of the things that we really hope to impact through this podcast.
I mean, very, very well said, Sammy. And I think, in addition to all that, I think our this podcast is for doing we started it because we want to inspire other people like us or younger those who are starting maybe their lives, want to inspire them, want to give them ideas, want them to inspire them, want to inspire change mainly to the positive, but also we want to you know inspire educators, because education is an important part. We've started talking about the podcast, talking about education. So we want to inspire educators. We want to tell them, maybe give them tips. We want to share our experiences, our very rich experiences. Because, and now I'm gonna sound like an American, because in the States you're allowed to brag a little bit. So whereas in Europe maybe not, so we're not allowed to as much to say that we're good at something. At least that's what we hear in Sweden. They always tell you, like in your CV, if you want to stick out, you need to write in your CV as an American, where you can, tell that you're good at something, because it's not part of the Swedish culture or even in the French.
Yep.
So there's this positive, like that's it's a positive thing about these states. So yeah, two things: inspire, change, and then I don't want to say teach, but maybe yeah, inspire educators as well about how to deal with their students, with the youth, because that's the future of our nations. And of course, part of a global mindset, definitely. I mean, today with the internet, my work, I work with people from all over the world, from my home, from the comfort of my home, or the comfort. You don't need to take a plane to go anywhere else. If in order for you to get in touch with other different cultures. So I think it's part of a bigger conversation what we're doing, and hopefully someone will benefit from it. And please, to our audience, if you have any suggestions or you think any questions or you think we could improve what we're doing in any way, please let us know.
Awesome.
I'll hand over to you, and I'll give you the last. I started the podcast. I'd like you to end it.
No,
Mhm.
thanks, Moses. Honestly, very, very well said. And I just first of all, we're humbled and privileged to be able to share our voice, to be able to lend our experience, to be able to help empower others as we seek also to empower and learn ourselves. And so, as Moses noted, come along for that journey. Let us know what we can do to what insight we can provide. We want to hear from you as well, and understand better about who our listeners are and what they seek and what impacts them. And we're excited. I mean, we're very pumped. We both have um, very we have a lot of stories to tell, but we also have a lot of things to learn, and so we're looking forward to learning together on that journey, and to sharing and listening as well. So thanks so much, and it's just great to be here. Thank you.